Lake of the Woods, Ontario, August 1933. A dock lantern that should have gone dark by 9 o'clock was still burning at midnight. Somewhere across 14,000 islands, more shoreline than most provinces, a man who had crossed this same water more than 60 times that summer alone had simply stopped coming home. There was no telephone to call. No radio warning had reached that shoreline that afternoon, and none would have mattered, because what came in off the water that evening arrived in minutes, not hours, the way it still can on this lake today. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the calm that followed the storm was almost worse than the storm itself. 9 o'clock came, then 10. Then a wife who had spent 3 summers building an evening around the sound of one engine realized she could no longer explain the silence as anything ordinary. What happened next was not organized by anyone. No dispatcher, no map, just 6 boats, pushed off 6 different docks within the same hour, by people who had never been asked to go looking, and went anyway, calling one name across water so still and so dark that a voice could carry farther than anyone standing on shore that night thought possible. Somewhere out there, on an island that was not his own, a man was about to make a decision that would either save him or cost this entire stretch of Lake of the Woods a story it would still be telling 60 years later. This is the night an island community stayed awake for one of its own, and nobody, not even the man they were searching for, knew yet how it would end. Lake of the Woods, Ontario, Friday, August 11th, 1933, 2:30 in the afternoon. Walter Doyle, 31, out of a small self-built camp on an island in the channels south of Coney Island, a half-hour's run from the Kenora docks, was doing what he did every Friday of the summer, without exception. He loaded the empty flour tins, the mail sack, and a folded grocery list into the bow of a 16-foot wooden boat with a single outboard motor, and pushed off across open water toward the town his family could see, on a clear day, as a smudge of rooftops beyond the nearer islands. His wife, Edna, 28, stood on the dock with their 2 children, Thomas, 10, and Alice, 7, and did what she did every Friday. She watched the boat until it was small against the water, then went back to the wash line, because a woman running an island camp alone for an afternoon did not spend it watching a horizon. Thomas asked, as he asked most Fridays, if he could go along next time. Alice asked nothing at all. She was watching a heron working the shallows near the dock, and had already forgotten there had been a boat. Nobody on that dock had any particular reason to remember this Friday. Walter Doyle had made this same run, in this same boat, more than 60 times since the ice went out in May, past the same 3 islands, through the narrow channel the local families called the Gut, out into the open stretch of water where Kenora's rooftops finally showed themselves, and back again before supper with the mail sack heavier than it left. The lake had never once given him reason to doubt it would let him make the 61st crossing exactly the way it had let him make the first. What the Doyle family's Friday actually depended on was not something any of them would have called a system, because it had never needed a name. The mail came into the island by Walter's hand, once a week, because there was no other way for it to come. The flour, the coal oil for the lamps, the tinned goods, the newspaper Edna read 3 days late and never minded. All of it arrived because a man got into a boat on a Friday afternoon and came back the same evening. On a lake with 14,000 islands and not one road reaching most of them, a family's whole connection to the rest of the country ran through a 16-foot boat, a single outboard motor, and the specific competence of the man who ran it. The sky when Walter pushed off was doing nothing in particular, a little haze to the west, the kind that had sat over the pines every close August afternoon that summer, without once turning into anything. Edna did not look at it twice. Nobody on Lake of the Woods in August 1933 checked a forecast before a Friday supply run, because there was no forecast to check, no radio report reliable enough to matter, No service reaching an island camp with warning of what the afternoon actually held. What a family had instead was pattern, the accumulated, unspoken knowledge of what this lake's weather usually did in August, at this hour, in this kind of haze. And pattern said nothing was wrong. It would take less than 3 hours for that pattern to be wrong, in a way none of them had ever seen it be wrong before. By 6 o'clock, the boat that had left the dock at 2:30, on a run that took perhaps 45 minutes each way with time in town besides, had not come back. Edna Doyle had not yet let herself call this late. She was still at the point in the evening where a woman tells herself a man stopped to talk to someone on the Kenora dock, that the mail was slow, that there was nothing yet in an empty stretch of water that needed explaining. What she did not yet know, what none of the families on the islands south of Coney Island yet knew, on an ordinary Friday evening that had given no one any reason to watch the sky, was that somewhere out on the open water between the islands, her husband was no longer running toward home at all. What was moving across Lake of the Woods that Friday evening that could turn a 45-minute run into something an island community would still be describing decades later? And what does a family's total dependence on one man, one boat, and one lake actually do to an ordinary Friday, the moment that dependence stops being ordinary? Before you can understand what an overdue boat meant to the Doyle family on the evening of August 11th, 1933, you need to understand what an island camp on Lake of the Woods actually was, mechanically, in the years before any road reached it. It was not a house with a driveway that happened to be replaced by water. It was a household running on a single weekly supply line, maintained entirely by one man's competence with one motor, on a lake large enough. Over 14,000 islands, more shoreline than many entire provinces, that getting the geography wrong by even one channel could put a man somewhere no one who knew him would think to look. The lantern was the rest of the system. Every island camp on this stretch of water kept one lit at the end of the dock on any evening a boat was expected home. Not for decoration, but because a lit dock lantern was the only signal a family had to offer the dark. A small, specific statement, visible for perhaps half a mile across still water, that said, "Someone here is waiting, and everything so far is as it should be." Neighboring camps learned to read each other's lanterns, without ever discussing it. A lantern that came on at the usual hour and went out at the usual hour meant nothing had happened worth noticing. A lantern still burning well past midnight meant something else entirely, and every family on that stretch of shoreline understood, without a single conversation ever having established the rule, that a lantern burning that late was a message meant to be seen. This was the entire communication network available to the islands south of Coney Island in 1933. No telephone wire reached any camp on that stretch of water, and would not for decades. No radio signal was reliable enough to carry a weather warning across the static and distance involved. What existed instead was a slower, older kind of infrastructure. People who paid enough attention to their neighbors' patterns that a broken pattern registered immediately, and who had, without ever formally agreeing to it, taken on the unpaid obligation of noticing. What this system demanded of a family like the Doyles was total, quiet reliability, every single week, because the system had no slack built into it. Walter Doyle's Friday run was not simply a chore. It was the load-bearing wall of his family's entire relationship to the mainland. The flour, the coal oil, the mail, the news of the outside world, all of it arriving because a man got in a boat and came back, week after week, with a regularity so complete that its absence, even once, meant something had genuinely gone wrong. There was no cushion built into island life in 1933. There was no second supply line, no neighbor with a telephone to call ahead. There was only Walter, the boat, the lake, and a lantern that either came on at the right hour to answer him, or burned on into a night with nothing behind it. What did it actually demand of a family, keeping a system like this running for 3 summers without a single failure, and what happens to that quiet confidence the very first time the system does not hold. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Canadian cottage and lake summer between 1920 and 1980. What an island camp actually required to survive a single ordinary week. What a family's dependence on one boat, one lantern, or one road genuinely meant. And what happened on the nights that dependence was tested. Not nostalgia for old photographs. The human and period-consistent social meaning of a way of life, a generation of Canadian families built their summers around. What an island cottage community gave a family like the Doyles was not simply solitude. It was the quiet, unspoken proof that on a lake with no telephone, safety was something neighbors built together, one lantern at a time, long before anyone had to ask them to. And if your family ever waited up for a boat, a car, or a train that was hours overdue, put it in the comments. What do you remember about that wait? And what did the people around you do while you waited? Next time on this channel, the outpost camp operator who became, without ever being asked, the closest thing 40 miles of shoreline had to a doctor. Back to the lake. To understand what 6 o'clock without a boat actually meant to Edna Doyle, you have to understand what a Friday evening on that dock was supposed to look like, because the Doyles had built it, without ever discussing it as a project, into a small and specific shape over 3 summers on that island. The shape went like this. Walter's motor was audible from a particular distance, and Thomas had learned, the way children learn things no one teaches them, to tell his father's engine from any other boat on the water by its exact pitch, announcing the sound minutes before an adult could hear it. Edna timed supper so it came off the stove within 20 minutes of the boat's arrival, not before, because a woman did not serve a hot meal to an empty chair. Alice's job, self-assigned at 5 and never given up, was to count the mail, to sit on the dock and sort whatever her father handed down into piles by who it was for, a task that meant nothing to the actual running of the household and everything to a 7-year-old's sense of being useful. None of this was written down anywhere. None of it needed to be. It was simply what a Friday was, in the specific architecture that 3 summers of repetition had built around one man's boat coming home. And like most rituals a family builds without noticing they are building one, its real value only became visible on the one evening it failed to happen on schedule. By 7 o'clock, Thomas had stopped announcing engine sounds, because none of the sounds crossing the water were the right one. Edna lit the dock lantern at its usual hour, the way she did every evening a boat was expected, not yet frightened, simply following the pattern, because following the pattern was itself a kind of reassurance. The supper stayed on the back of the stove, no longer timed to anything. What Edna Doyle would not admit to herself for another hour, and would never quite explain to her children in words, was what the lantern actually meant to her, now that it was lit with no boat in sight to answer it. It was not being lit to guide her husband home anymore. It had quietly become something closer to a question, thrown out across dark water toward whatever had happened to him, with no way of knowing whether anything at all was there to answer it. The insider truth of an island evening like this one was never really about the weather, or even, at first, about danger. It was about the specific psychological work a family does in the gap between "he's late" and "something is wrong," the careful, deliberate slowness with which a mother allows herself to move from one word to the other, because the moment she says the second word out loud, the whole shape of the evening changes for her children too, and she was not ready, not yet, to hand them that. What was actually happening to Walter Doyle, out on the open water between the islands, while his wife lit a lantern for a boat that was no longer coming, and how much longer would it take before an entire stretch of shoreline understood that this was not an ordinary late evening at all? Walter Doyle left the Kenora dock a little after 5, the mail sack heavier than it left home, a fresh sack of flour and a tin of coal oil wedged behind the middle thwart. He had stopped longer than usual to talk with a man from a neighboring bay about a broken pump, and the delay put him on open water at almost exactly the hour when the haze that had sat harmlessly over the pines all week finally organized itself into something else. What builds over a lake the size of Lake of the Woods on a hot August afternoon, and what boaters and meteorologists still describe the same way nearly a century later, is a specific and well-understood phenomenon, a line squall, a fast-moving band of thunderstorm activity that can arrive with almost no warning, turning a calm stretch of water into white-capped chaos within minutes rather than hours. On a lake with the open fetch Lake of the Woods offers, no long coastline to slow the wind, only water and islands. A squall like this does not need much distance to build serious waves. It needs only a few minutes and enough open water, and Walter Doyle, coming out of the gut into the widest crossing of his whole route, had exactly that. The wind did not build gradually. It arrived, the way people who have been caught in a genuine line squall always describe it. First a strange stillness, a held breath in the air, and then, within what felt like seconds, a wall of wind out of the west that turned the flat water in front of his bow into a field of short, steep chop. The sky he had glanced at without concern, an hour earlier, was now a wall of moving gray-black cloud, and the specific islands he navigated by, familiar shapes he could have named, blindfolded on any ordinary evening, had begun to look, in the sudden dark and driving rain, disturbingly alike. Walter Doyle did the only thing a competent lakeman could do in that situation. He did not try to outrun the storm across open water. He cut his speed, kept his bow into the worst of the chop to avoid broaching, and looked for the nearest island shelter he could reach, without capsizing. This was the correct decision. It was also, in the reduced visibility and driving rain of a squall moving across a lake with 14,000 islands, a decision that required him to guess, because in that kind of weather, on that kind of water, even a man who had run this route 60 times could no longer be entirely certain which granite shoreline he was actually approaching. He made land. That much at least went right. What he did not yet know, tying his boat to an unfamiliar dock in blinding rain as the light failed completely around him, was that the island he had reached was not the one he had spent 3 summers calling home, and that the family whose lantern he could just make out through the rain, climbing the path toward a cabin he had never seen before, were not his own. What does it actually feel like, for a man who has run the same water 60 times, to realize, soaked, in the dark, with a storm still working overhead, that for the first time in 3 summers, he genuinely does not know which island he has just landed on? The same squall that caught Walter Doyle on open water reached the islands south of Coney Island, perhaps 20 minutes later, and it announced itself to Edna the same way it had announced itself to him, a strange stillness first, then wind out of the west hard enough to bend the young pines beside the cabin and drive rain sideways across the dock, where her lantern was still burning. For a woman who had spent the last hour trying not to name what she already suspected, the storm did something almost merciful. It gave the delay a visible cause. Of course he was late. Any sensible man would have put in somewhere until this passed. Edna told Thomas this, and mostly believed it herself, and went inside to keep the children away from the worst of the wind, checking the lantern through the window every few minutes to be sure the storm had not blown it out. It had not. It burned on, hour after hour, through a storm that passed within 40 minutes and left the night afterward unnervingly calm, the specific, ordinary quiet of an August evening on Lake of the Woods, as if nothing at all had happened. And it was that calm, more than the storm itself, that told Edna Doyle something was genuinely wrong. A sensible man, who had put in somewhere to wait out a squall, would have been back on the water within the hour, once conditions eased. 9 o'clock came, and then 10, on water flat enough that there was no longer any excuse for it. What happened next was not a decision Edna Doyle made alone, because on this stretch of shoreline, a lantern still burning at 10 o'clock on a calm night was never only one family's business. Bill Whitmore, whose camp sat on the next island north, had noticed the Doyle lantern still lit at an hour it should have been out, and had already put his own boat in the water by the time Edna worked up the nerve to signal for help. A lit lantern swung 3 times across the dock, the closest thing this stretch of shoreline had to an alarm bell. Ernie Hallett ran the small outpost camp 2 islands over, the kind of man every scattered island community produced without meaning to. Not officially in charge of anything, but the person neighbors went to first because he owned the fastest boat, knew every channel by feel, and had, over 15 years running fishing parties out of these waters, developed something close to a mental map of every family living within 10 miles of his dock. By 10:30, Ernie Hallett's boat was moving from island to island in the dark, calling in at every lit dock, gathering names and boats the way a fire gathers fuel. With no telephone to call, no radio to broadcast a warning, and a lake with 14,000 islands to search, how does a scattered handful of families with nothing but boats and lanterns actually organize a search for one missing man in the middle of the night? And what does it say about a community that they simply did? By 11 o'clock, 6 boats were moving through the channels south of Coney Island, and not one of them had been assigned to do it by anyone. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy, looking back at a night like this from a world of dispatch radios and organized rescue services, to imagine it as more orderly than it actually was. There was no search coordinator. There was no map with the water divided into sectors. There was Ernie Hallett's rough sense of which channels a disoriented man running from a squall might plausibly have reached. 6 men, and 2 of their older sons who had simply gotten into boats because a neighbor needed finding, and a method of searching that amounted to calling a name across open water and listening, in the total silence of a lake at midnight, for anything that answered. "Doyle," called out across black water, again and again, from 6 different boats moving along 6 different shorelines, the name carrying strangely far across still water at night, the way sound does on a lake with nothing to absorb it. At certain islands, families who had never met Walter Doyle came down to their own docks in nightclothes to listen, because a name being called like that in the middle of the night meant someone needed to be found, and a family that could offer nothing else could at least offer its own silence, straining to hear if an answer came back from anywhere near their shore. This was, in its own unglamorous way, the entire emergency response infrastructure available to an island community on Lake of the Woods in 1933. Not incompetence, not primitiveness, exactly. A genuinely different kind of system, one built on the assumption that if help was ever going to come, it would have to come from whoever happened to be close enough to hear you, and that the obligation to be that person for a neighbor was simply understood, the way the obligation to notice a strange lantern was understood, without ever needing to be formally agreed to. The insider truth of a search like this one was that it worked, when it worked, not because anyone involved was especially heroic, but because a community like this one had spent years quietly building the only infrastructure available to it: attention. Ernie Hallett knew which families lived where, because he had spent 15 years learning it, one fishing party at a time. Bill Whitmore knew to watch the Doyle lantern because 3 summers of watching it every night had made its pattern part of his own evening without his ever choosing to learn it. None of this had been built for this night specifically. It had simply been there, waiting, the way infrastructure always is, until the one night it was actually needed. If 6 unassigned boats, a handful of names called across dark water, and a community's years of quiet attention to each other's patterns were the entire rescue system available that night, what, exactly, would it take to actually find one man on a lake with 14,000 islands, in the dark, with none of it working the way it should. Before you can fully understand why a search like this one was even necessary, why 6 boats went out calling a name into the dark instead of someone simply telephoning ahead to check, you need to understand what Lake of the Woods actually was, as a piece of regional infrastructure, in August 1933. The road connecting this stretch of northwestern Ontario to the rest of the province by a continuous highway did not yet exist. Highway 71, the road that would eventually link Kenora south to Fort Frances, and, through it, to the rest of Ontario's road network, would not be completed for another 3 years. In 1933, a family living on an island south of Coney Island had, in practical terms, exactly one way in and one way out: water. Not water as one option among several, the way a modern cottager might choose between a car, a water taxi, or a seaplane. Water as the only option that existed. This was not a new problem in 1933, and it was not unique to the Doyle family's stretch of shoreline. Regional accounts from the earlier steamship era on this same lake described night travel across Lake of the Woods as something close to genuinely impossible. Not dangerous in the abstract, but functionally unnavigable, given the sheer density of islands, channels, and near-identical granite shorelines that made the lake, after dark, a maze even experienced boatmen approached with real caution. What Walter Doyle discovered on the night of August 11th, 1933, was not a new hazard. It was the oldest and best documented hazard on this particular body of water. One boatman and steamship captains had been navigating carefully around for decades before his family ever built a camp there. Telephone service, where it existed at all in rural Canada in 1933, ran along roads, strung on poles beside routes that had already been built for other reasons. An island with no road had, by simple extension, no telephone, and no realistic prospect of one for years to come. Radio existed, but a household set reliable enough to receive weather warnings across the distance and interference involved was a luxury few island camps carried, and even where one was carried, there was no regional broadcast service in 1933 built specifically to warn small craft on inland lakes of a fast-forming squall. What this meant, in practice, on the night Walter Doyle went missing, was that every tool available to search for him already existed before anyone needed it. Boats, lanterns, voices, and a community's accumulated knowledge of its own geography, because no other tool had ever been built. The infrastructure of rescue on Lake of the Woods in 1933 was not primitive by accident. It was, quite simply, the only infrastructure the region's geography and its stage of development had made possible. With the nearest continuous road still 3 years from completion, and the nearest reliable communication running no faster than a boat could carry it, what did it actually mean for a family on Lake of the Woods to trust their entire safety, every single week, to nothing but water, attention, and each other? What Walter Doyle actually did, once he had tied his boat to an unfamiliar dock in the last gray light of the storm, was the only sensible thing left to him. He climbed the path toward the lit window he could see through the trees, and knocked. The family who opened the door, a couple named Whitmore, whose camp sat nearly 2 miles north of the Doyle Island, close enough that Walter had likely passed their shoreline dozens of times without ever once stopping there, did exactly what island camp families on Lake of the Woods did in 1933 for a soaked stranger arriving out of a storm at their door. They let him in without a second thought. There was no question of turning him away to try the water again in the dark. There was barely a question at all. A man caught out in weather like that, on a lake like this, was simply given a chair by the stove, dry clothes if any fit him, and whatever was left of supper. What Walter Doyle did not have, sitting in a stranger's kitchen with rain still ticking off the eaves outside, was any way to tell his own family he was safe. The Whitmores had no telephone either. No camp on that stretch of water did. and going back out onto water this dark, in a squall that had only just passed, and might easily build again, was not a risk any of the adults in that kitchen considered worth taking for a message that could just as easily wait until morning. Walter Doyle spent the night of August 11th, 1933, in a chair in a house he had never been inside before, among people whose names he had learned only a few hours earlier, while 2 miles south, his own wife sat up through the same night, not knowing whether he was alive. He woke before first light, the way a man does when he has not really been asleep at all, and was on the water again, the moment there was enough gray in the sky to navigate by. The Whitmores gave him a proper breakfast first. This, too, was simply what was done, and pointed him toward the channel that would take him home, a channel he now recognized instantly in the flat, ordinary light of a clear morning, the same channel that had looked, 12 hours earlier, disturbingly unlike anything he knew. He came around the last point into sight of his own dock a little after 6, into a scene that had clearly been holding its breath all night. Edna still at the water's edge where she had likely stood for hours, Thomas beside her, and further off, 2 of Ernie Hallett's search boats drifting back in from a night spent calling a name across water that had, until that exact moment, given nothing back. There is a particular sound a small outboard motor makes at a distance across still morning water, and Thomas Doyle, 10 years old, and by then exhausted past the point of pretending he was not frightened, heard it before anyone else did, and was already running down the dockboards before he had said a single word to explain why. What does a family actually say to each other in the first minute after a night like that ends? And what does an island community do with a rescue that never quite became one, because the man everyone searched for all night had simply been sitting, safe and dry, in a stranger's kitchen the entire time? Nobody on the island south of Coney Island called what happened on the night of August 11th, 1933, a tragedy, because nothing tragic had actually happened. Nobody called it a rescue either, not exactly, because by the time anyone reached him, Walter Doyle had already rescued himself simply by knocking on the right door. What it became instead, in the retelling that started that same morning and never really stopped, was something closer to a story a family and a community told each other for the rest of their lives. The night the storm cut off the island, as it came to be known on that stretch of shoreline, still repeated at docks and campfires on Lake of the Woods, decades after every person actually present that night had grown old. What made it worth telling, summer after summer, was never really the danger, because the actual danger, examined honestly, had been real but brief. A bad hour of weather, a wrong turn in poor visibility, a night's discomfort, nothing more. What made it worth telling was everything that happened around the danger. A lantern lit at the wrong hour and understood instantly by a neighbor who had never been asked to watch for it. 6 boats in the water within an hour, none of them dispatched by anyone. A family of strangers who took in a soaked man without a single question and gave him their own supper. A 10-year-old boy who could pick his father's engine out of silence before anyone else on the dock even heard a sound. The insider truth this whole night revealed, the thing Edna Doyle understood standing at the water's edge at dawn, watching her husband's boat come around the point, in a way she could not have explained the week before, was that her family's safety on that island had never actually depended on Walter alone, the way it had always felt like it did. It depended on an entire unnamed network of people who had spent years, without ever calling it anything, learning to notice each other. The lantern only worked because someone else was watching for it. The search only happened because a stranger's dock existed to be knocked on. Isolation, on Lake of the Woods in 1933, was real, but it had never actually been as alone as it felt on an ordinary Friday evening, and it took one genuinely frightening night to make that fact visible. Thomas Doyle would tell this story to his own children decades later, at his own cottage on a different lake, with electricity, and a telephone on the wall, and none of the fear any longer attached to it. And what he would always come back to, retelling it, was not the storm at all. It was the sound of 6 boats he never saw, calling a name across water in the dark, from people who owed his family nothing, and came anyway. What does a community actually build, summer after summer, without ever writing it down or naming it? And what does it take, most of the time, for a family to find out it was there at all? In August 1933, the road that would finally connect Kenora south along the lake was still 3 years from being finished. When Highway 71 opened in 1936, it did not reach the Doyle family's island. No road ever would, not directly. But it changed everything around them. Kenora itself became easier to reach from farther south. Supply routes into the region grew less dependent on rail and boat alone, and the wider isolation that had made a single Friday boat run feel like a family's entire connection to the country began, slowly, to loosen. The telephone came later still, not to the island itself, which never did get a wire, but to Kenora's expanding rural exchange through the 1940s and 1950s, and eventually, for camps close enough to the mainland, a party line strung along routes that had not existed in 1933. By the time Thomas Doyle was raising his own children at his own cottage on a different lake in the 1960s, a phone on the wall meant a father who was late could simply be asked where he was. A boy no longer had to learn his father's engine by ear. A mother no longer had to light a lantern and wait for a pattern to break before she was allowed to be afraid. What the wires and the road genuinely gave the families of Lake of the Woods, decade by decade, was real, and no one who lived through the alternative would trade it back. A telephone call takes 30 seconds. A search organized without one takes half a night, 6 boats, and a great deal of unrepayable trust. What it did not give them, what no wire has ever been built to carry, was the specific thing 6 boats did, unasked, on the night of August 11th, 1933. Neighbors who noticed a lantern burning at the wrong hour because they had spent years, without meaning to, learning to notice. A family of strangers who opened a door to a soaked man without a single question, because that was simply what was done. A community that organized itself, in the dark, with nothing but water and attention, because the obligation to be that for one another had never needed writing down. Edna Doyle did not know, standing at the water's edge that August dawn, that she had spent 3 summers building something the coming highway and the coming telephone line would eventually make unnecessary. She understood it only much later, decades on the evening her own grown son picked up a telephone to check on a friend running late, and she found herself, without quite meaning to, walking out to the dock instead, out of habit, she told herself, though it was not really habit at all, to see if a lantern, somewhere, still needed lighting. No one had ever thought to ask the telephone to notice. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Canadian lake summer meant to the people who actually lived it, subscribe. There are more islands, more storms, more ordinary Fridays that turned, within a few hours, into the night an entire stretch of shoreline stayed awake for one of its own. What an island cottage community gave a family like the Doyles was not simply solitude. It was the quiet, unspoken proof that on a lake with no telephone, safety was something neighbors built together, one lantern at a time, long before anyone had to ask them to. And if someone in your family ever waited up for a boat, a car, or a train that was hours overdue, put it in the comments. What do you remember about that wait? And what did the people around you do while you waited? Next time on this channel, the outpost camp operator who became, without ever being asked, the closest thing 40 miles of shoreline had to a doctor. The Doyle family's island never did get its own telephone line. The lantern stayed at the end of that dock for as long as the family kept the camp. What the mainland eventually gave the wider lake: a road in 1936, A telephone exchange within reach by the 1950s, a way to ask instead of wait. What it did not give the families of Lake of the Woods, 6 boats going out unasked, into the dark, for a neighbor they might never have properly met. Edna Doyle did not know this was what she had been part of building, all those quiet Friday evenings. She knew it the night the lantern burned past midnight, and 6 boats went out anyway. The lake had known what to do with them. No one had thought to tell the telephone to ask.